Hi, this is Paul Bance of GreatDad.com, and I'm really excited to have one of my first interviews I ever did on GreatDad.com. Dr. Robert Brooks who's a legend in really what I think is a revolution in how we look at parenting. And Bob, I went back and I looked back at this book, which we discussed a long time, Raising a Self-Disciplined Child. And when we talked in 2007, my kids were 3 and 7. And then looking back at the book, what really struck me was you were talking back then about how you like disciplinary approaches, like spanking your child, not good. And you're like the very basics, which seem like that was just 15 years ago, but still, I mean, I don't know very many people who talk like that. So I'd love to hear about your perspective on just how the world has changed since you started talking about these issues.
Well, I'm smiling because the reality is certainly in the last year, it has totally changed. But it's interesting, that book, because when you mentioned right before we went on that you interviewed me in 2007, I was going to say, was that for the book Raising a Self-Disciplined Child? And then when you held up the cover, I realized it was. So just let me tell you a little about my thinking, and then the world having changed. With my colleague Sam Goldstein, back in 2001, we wrote a book, Raising Resilient Children. Mm-hmm. And in that book, we looked at what helps kids to bounce back and overcome adversity. How do you basically function competently when under duress? And there was a lot of fun writing that book. And what we tried to look at are what are the characteristics of resilient children? What is their mindset? So we would have guideposts as parents to help kids be resilient. Then, I can't believe that it took 6 years, but maybe 5. About 5 years later, so we talked about, one of the things that we really emphasized, but not enough in Raising Resilient Children, was this whole concept of discipline. That you really needed inner control as parents, and you want to develop it in kids, to be able to develop what we call the resilient mindset. So that led us to sit down and do this book, Raising a Self-Disciplined Child. And, it's interesting. We really decided not to call it How to Discipline Your Child, but we basically said this: we need discipline to reach other goals. Discipline stems from the word disciple. It is a teaching process. And so what we want kids to think about is, or as parents, how do we help kids develop self-discipline? Because for years I've been saying discipline is necessary. No child comes into the world disciplined, if you will. And then I had to look at, well, what's the main purpose of discipline? One is you want a safe and secure environment, but the other was you want kids to internalize discipline. So even when you're not there, they will think before they act. So we did that book. And in there, I talked about some of my views about spanking and some of the research about spanking. And I went over in that book, the 3 now, there are actually 4 main, I'd say, categories of parenting and discipline. And the one I said that was most in accord with my philosophy was what they called authoritative, not authoritarian, where basically there's a lot of love, but you feel comfortable setting limits. And as kids grow older, you involve them much more in the responsibilities and how and how they learn to discipline themselves. And we could go back over some of these, but then a couple of years ago, I've been collaborating with Sam Goldstein for years. What was really emerging, and in the last decade, was some very fascinating research that some of the characteristics of resilience and self-discipline are really there from birth. And what we realize, and I'll get into some of this, because some of the research I looked into,
fascinating in the new book.
I didn't even realize, like, already there are precursors of empathy and altruism when kids are just several months old.
Right. You talk about fairness and these basic ideas.
Exactly. So then what we did is, we said, okay, resilience is really performing competently under duress. I don't want to simplify too much. And then discipline has to do with the inner control to be able to behave in certain ways. And then we said, if there are these instincts from birth, we said, this is what really fuels self-discipline and resilience. You have these forces, these inner attributes from birth. They're there, and they provide the fuel to help kids develop self-discipline and develop resilience. So Sam is more the researcher and scientist in this. He looked at a lot of the research, and he said, the research shows there were 7 main, what we called instincts, these inner attributes that have been there for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. They helped us to survive. And since they are there, I remember when we were first talking about this, I'm smiling to say this because at first I said, wait a second, I don't want to rewrite Raising Resilient Children. So I also was doing more research into it. I said, since they're there, how do we help them really to blossom, to reach fruition? These 7 instincts, because these 7 instincts are vital for people to be self-disciplined and vital for people to be resilient. It's almost like the fuel is there. There are certain characteristics. Now the job of parents is really just to I was going to say, add to that fuel, reinforce that fuel.
Yeah.
And it was really, you could see me smiling. What was really fun, Paul, is, as I'm writing this, I'm still questioning some things, and I'm saying, wow, this is an interesting study. Wow, this is an interesting study. These things, these attributes, these instincts, and they're not like instincts of building a nest, because some people, when I've mentioned instincts, they say, oh, it's just, it's almost there without thought. No, it's for us, it's an intuitive way of thinking and acting, and it's not just a simple building a nest or is it salmons that's go upstream something. So I wanted to mention that. So they're there. Some people have called it, these genetic characteristics, and one of the people who looked at the book said, this is really good because what you're saying is there are these very important attributes that help in survival. They're there. So our job as parents, grandparents, caregivers is to understand them and find ways of nurturing them. That's a little long-winded, but your question triggered. I almost wanted to share with you, that path, if you will.
Yeah, I'm very interested in the title of the book. The title of the new book is Tenacity in Children, Nurturing these 7 Instincts for Lifetime Success. And there are a few words in there that are very interesting to me. One is resilience versus tenacity. I'm really interested in your view of that. And I think also you and I probably would agree that success is however you determine it.
Yes.
It could be some version of what we call happiness or achievement of your life's purpose or ease and flow in your life or whatever, but those are interesting distinctions.
Yes, I don't know which one to take first because
tenacity versus resilience.
Okay.
Resilience,
well, actually, how Sam and I have looked at it, we've called it. It's basically the essential triad of human development. So we talked about resilience, self-discipline, and tenacity. So they're separate, but they're certainly related to each other. We almost saw that, if you will, resilience was a certain mindset that you felt you could accomplish things, overcome adversity. You felt you had ways of coping. And now the same characteristics, some of them are certainly in self-discipline and tenacity, but we saw tenacity, since these are these inborn traits, almost that, as I mentioned before, almost the fuel that gets you going so that you could be more resilient, more self-disciplined. And it overlaps. Again, well, I'll be smiling a lot because your questions are, they're triggering a lot of the discussions, the inner discussions I had and the ones with Sam, that we said, even the 7 instincts, when we get to them, they're all, related in a way. So resilience for me was certain behaviors you showed and a certain outlook when faced with adversity and how you cope with it. And discipline, again, was that inner control so you could focus on these things. And tenacity was almost that, hey, there are these wonderful characteristics that fuel us towards self-discipline and resilience. And probably anyone listening will say, I'm still confused, but hopefully it's a little clearer, in the book.
Well, I think we'll get into the instincts. I think those are super clear in the book as you go through each one of them and what they mean, and some of them are very self-evident, like empathy. but the other thing I'm interested in is, I guess how this all developed. I don't know what I'm trying to say here, but
well, while you're thinking, I wanted to get back to, you mentioned something about success and how it could be different.
Yeah.
So I don't know if you want me to respond.
Sure. Yeah. No, and success and how we determine it, because I think a lot of people, especially in this world today, are thinking like, how's my kid going to get a good job? Why isn't he getting straight A's? I want him to be a doctor, and that's not always what is really success in.
Matter of fact, what I love the question, and I will, I'll emphasize why and share with you why, is that, I had an intruding thought, so I'll bring up the intruding thought. There was some research done by Richard Weisbord at the Harvard Graduate School of Education where, and you'll see how it ties to the question you raised, where he gave a questionnaire to thousands and thousands and thousands of middle and high school students in our country. And what he found was actually somewhat startling. Maybe it shouldn't have been, but maybe it's more disturbing, that these middle and high school kids said that getting good grades in school, and I don't want to overly simplify this, but getting good grades in school was more important than being compassionate or caring. And part of it is, he also, Rich Weisbord, they gave questionnaires to parents who said compassion and caring is very important. But basically the kids' response was, if it's so important, why do we discuss homework and grades much more so than compassion and caring? So what your question really triggered for me is the following. Even when I discussed resilience back now almost 20 years ago in that first book, I really felt very strongly that you should not be discussing resilience just in terms of success, in terms of grades you get or your job or how much money you have. And in that book, I introduced the idea of that a major focus of resilience, and it's also one of the instincts here we talk about, is a major focus is really how caring and compassionate you are, like the research Weisbord did. And if you'll notice, when we get into the tenacity, a lot of it has very little, well, I shouldn't say very little, a lot of it does not have to do with the grades you get in school or what college you go to. Because in there, we talk about responsibility and accountability, compassion, and empathy. And when I think about the research done at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, I think of so much of the emphasis on what are your grades and how much starting salary you have. I think we lose the ability to really be as resilient as we can. We certainly lose the ability to be as compassionate. So my view, when you say success, it's great if you have a nice job and, a lot of the trappings are wonderful. But what really, and I hope was captured in the new book, what really when you asked before, I had this intruding thought again about the evolution of ideas, is I've been writing much more since that book on discipline about our purpose in life, what brings meaning to us. I've been writing about it in terms of the pandemic. What are some of the things that really helps us to be resilient? And the instincts are there. It's how we bring them out. So success for me, and I think for a lot of people, but we get caught up in these other measures, has a lot to do certainly with compassion and caring and the purpose and meaning in life that goes far beyond, I'll say, some of the external trappings that we have. Yeah. And that's been certainly a big change for me. And it's been reinforced even more during this past year, connections with other people and what's really important in life.
Yeah. Well, I think right now we are kind of still fighting up that battle between some of the values that you're talking about versus a time when we're very worried about how America is competing on the world stage, or whether baby boomers have coddled their kids by being too loving and caring and supportive, and whether you can go too far, and what is the intersection of those two? Where I used to ask this question for every interview: was can you love your child too much? And I've always been very much arguing that you cannot give enough security and love to a child. That's just not possible. But I suppose there are situations where you could coddle a child too much and avoid them seeing adversity and not developing the resilience.
Oh, yes. I was ready to jump in right away. I agree. I don't think you can love your child too much, but if the love borders aren't coddling or rushing in and rescuing them, and it's often out of good intent. None of us want to see our kids hurting, but we have to remember, like, a basic part of resilience, self-discipline, and tenacity, that triad, is really helping kids to learn from setbacks and mistakes. That's another thing, by the way, I've been writing much more about. How do you prepare kids for the setbacks and obstacles they will face? And probably I'm emphasizing that more also because, based even on the question you get, it's, you know what it's like when people have said to me, I'm not going to be empathic towards my kids because then they'll take advantage of me. And I say,
yes, right.
I'll say, the best disciplinarians I've ever met are the most empathic, because they're always asking, how do I discipline in a way where my child will listen to me rather than resent me or, go against my wishes? I said, if your kid's not listening to you, it's really more of an issue of your effectiveness as a disciplinarian. So I'm really glad you brought it up, because I don't think you could love your kid too much. I think I may have written a little about that in the book, but when I get questions, can you spoil a 6-month-old if you pick them up? Yeah. I still get those. And I said, I don't think so. I really don't think so. But, I know there are all these questions and doubts. And I start with the assumption every parent wants to try to do a good job. Sometimes we go in different directions. I certainly, if you interviewed my 2 sons who are grown now, they could certainly tell you about a few times that I didn't follow my own writings in that regard. But
well, I gotta say, I tried to follow all your writings, and that happens.
Would you write a note to my sons?
It does. In your book, they're just anecdotally, it's really funny. On page 100, you talk about the limits of love and virtuous responsibility, and that no kid ever thanks you for being like setting limits or whatever. My kids actually have. I've got a 21-year-old, and she said, I really appreciate the fact that you set limits, and we were, and it's a heartwarming thing when they finally do back and say, thank you, Dr. Brooks.
Well, no, that is really lovely, because I'll tell you a similar story. My son, Rich, was older than that. Oh, his whole field is social media. And I was asked to give a talk. And I just want to share this with you. Sometimes you don't know as a parent what your kids have heard.
Yeah, you don't know what they're going to
Rich was the one who felt homework was optional while his teachers did not for 4 years. And so it was very aggravating on that. But the reason I bring this up, so I was invited to give a talk, Raising Resilient Children in the Digital World. And I said, you know what I would like to do? I'd like my son to join me. He lives in the Portland, Maine area. I live right outside Boston, so it's an easy ride for him. Because he really, that's his field. Plus he has 2 daughters, and so he's had to do that. Anyway, the reason I tell you this story, and it really ties that, during the talk, I don't know how it came up. I mean, the parents were more interested in Rich than me because he knew all about different programs and things. He said, my father, one thing was, I may have disagreed with him, but he really modeled a lovely moral compass or something, some words like that. Wow. And I sat there, my wife was with me because she especially wanted to hear Rich. And I always teared up. I said, oh God, I could think of all those battles and all my insecurities about, was I being too harsh? Was I being too lenient? I don't care, and all of those. I mean, I'm glad I had a son like Rich, because else I would have felt, just apply every principle I say and your kid is going to not have any. Like mine. But it's the same thing with you. So it's his way of saying, to your daughter, it was almost saying that, we may have had a fight, but you really kept, or conveyed a certain morality that was very important. So sorry for that, but
no, but I think it's a good advice for fathers and parents. Is just, it's really a long game,
Yeah.
It's not one night ruined it all and that was it. It's how you portray that relationship and your values.
Yeah, thank you, because I didn't know if I took too long giving that vignette. That's why I said I'm sorry, but you're right. It really is. Even though I kid about saying kids may not say at the moment anyway, thank you for setting limits. I see how much you love me. but all kids, when we talked about discipline, no kid really wants to grow up in a home where he or she feels stronger than the parents and they could do what they want. It's very, as one teenager once said to me, I felt I was unloved because my parents wouldn't set limits.
Yeah.
Even though that same teenager, this girl said, but I always fought them tooth and nail.
Yeah. No, I do. I think those limits are one of the biggest expressions of love, because they take discipline on the parents' part. It's always easier to say, yes, have another piece of candy, or yes, go out and have fun. But it's harder to say, I love you so much that I'm not going to always say
exactly.
Yeah. So let's get into the instincts. I'm just conscious of your time, Bob, is going through the instincts and where they came from, and how I'm also interested because you say that they have implications also for us as adults at the same time as they have implications for kids.
Well, yeah, when, my colleague, Sam Goldstein, is more the researcher. And so he looked at all this and he pinpointed these 7 instincts. And then when I started doing my own research, I said, yeah. And the reason I say that they're at birth. So we want to certainly develop in our kids. But if we're going to be effective parents, we serve as critical models. So in many of the chapters, each chapter is on a different instinct. I say one of the most important things is how you model these. And it's not like, here are 7 instincts, we're going to develop them, and then by the time you're 21, they're not as important. They're there through our senior year. Yeah. And some of them, in my research and other people's research, become even more important. So the 7 instincts were there. But what really interested me, Paul, as we've been talking, is some of the research showing how their manifestations or precursors were there when the kids were just a few weeks old, some of them, or certainly when a kid was 2 or 3, which was very encouraging because I'm saying it's there. It's the seeds are there. How do we bring them out? So we listed the 7 instincts. We made clear that these are not instincts like building a bird nest, that, it's intuitive ways of thinking and behaving. And then we took each instinct, and we have, as all of our books, we have a lot of clinical vignettes in there, or vignettes, because I find many parents reading these books like to get a sense of, okay, what do you actually say and do with kids to help that way? And so the research I was doing is, okay, let me look at this. In whatever one was intuitive optimism. What's the research show? How do we help kids be more optimistic? And then that led to concepts like disposition. I won't go into all of them, dispositional optimism. So I said, there's a body of research out there that one of the other goals of writing this book was to try to bring it together in ways that were quite understandable, I think, and to really show that there's a lot of goodness in us, if you will, that has helped us survive over thousands and thousands of years, these instincts.
Well, that was the thing that I was trying to remember earlier.
Okay.
Is that juxtaposition between what we think of as like the lizard brain and the stuff that makes us act out in defense, that some people say, you should conquer those kind of instincts, which is to be super suspicious and anxious and all the things that get you the next meal, versus some of the values that you talk about that are more leading to more of an evolved human being that can both fend off disaster and is aware of danger, but is also able to be what we call happy, more empathetic, more joyful, more calm, more peaceful, all those things that are better in life.
We saved the negative for the last chapter. We call it the unholy trinity. And exactly what you said. There are some instincts that served probably our ancestors way back that nowadays add to a lot of divisiveness and whatever, like a rigid adherence to belief. Maybe 10,000 years ago, you really had to have the belief the sun was going to come up in the morning or something. And fear of differences. People really, we don't know for sure, but, people stayed in their own tribe whatever. So we looked at also those, and we said, it's not that they're bad. They helped us to survive, but nowadays they often come up in the form of different isms like racism or whatever. So we said they are there, but we also have these other instincts, which if we promote, just to select one, compassionate empathy, that helps do away with one of the third instinct had to do with defensive aggression. You're more empathic. So we had these three more negative that at one point served a purpose that now have led to a lot of the divisiveness and racism. And then, we basically have said, so what are those instincts that we can basically nurture in our children so that any negative instincts that are negative now that may have served a purpose 10,000 years ago, who knows for sure, although there's interesting research and thoughts by evolutionary psychologists and others, neuroanthropologists, all these different professions also. So what you just brought up is very important. There are rigid adherence to belief is you have a belief and you stick by it. In our book, we give examples even of a kid believing, I think one of the examples was who he was born with half a brain, and he stuck to that. And that led to a lot of different behaviors. He was a kid with learning problems. And it was harder for him then to have some of these other positive instincts develop because the negative ones were so strong. And let's face it, as we think about the last year, certainly there's COVID, but the George Floyd murder, the divisiveness at the election and the continued divisiveness, those are such negative forces that continue that we really have to concentrate more and more on these positive ones to hopefully temper these negative ones. Now, I know people listening who haven't seen the book, it's not even officially out yet. I think it'll be hopefully in a couple of weeks. Might be saying, well, what is this all about? So anyway, 7 positive instincts we say, and then there were some instincts that served the purpose, but now unfortunately are leading to a great deal of divisiveness. Mm-hmm. And it's for our protection, but it would help to protect us years ago, but now it just leads to divisiveness.
So maybe we should do, I don't know if we've got time to go in depth in
sure.
each, but could we go through all 7 and explain how they
sure.
and how they're
important? And I'll just give a quick, I'll give certainly just a quick overview of each. Yeah, we could spend an hour in this. And,
yeah, I know.
Each one I'll say
great depth with anecdotes and research. It's research backed.
Yeah, as you saw in the book, there's at the beginning of each of the instincts. Really, what we've tried to do is put the research, very interesting, intriguing research, to support the notion of these are instincts, they're there. But we could start. So I don't know if you want to go in the order. I think we have them in the book, so I'll let you select them.
Well, the one that I resonate the most with, and I think is basically the superpower of parents, and the thing that we're really trying to develop in kids that has the greatest. Well, I shouldn't probably put a value on it versus one or the other, but is empathy, and it's the strongest part of who we are as human beings, how we connect, how we connect with our kids, and what we need to teach them.
Yeah, a matter of fact, it's not. I don't want to say this because who's your favorite child? Who's your favorite? But I've written so much about empathy, and in this book we call it compassion and empathy. And just to also share with you why, here too, looking at some of the research, researchers really distinguish between compassion and empathy, and so we put it together. So I'll quickly mention this, and then just to give a little of the research. Empathy, and I hope I'm not overly simplifying it, but empathy is often understood as the capacity to put yourself inside the shoes of another person and see the world through their eyes. And in the book, we emphasize that empathy has 2 components. There's a cognitive component. So in order to put yourself in someone else's shoes, you have to understand really the world. It's a cognitive understanding, but there's also an affective or emotional. To understand another person's feelings, you've also had to at least experience some of these feelings, in that regard. Now, when I was looking at these terms, what some researchers, and this really resonated with me, they said, so empathy is the ability to put yourself in someone's shoes and see the world through their eyes. But several of the researchers basically said, and compassion is really acting on empathy and being helpful or compassionate towards others. And I like that. So one was an understanding and one was acting on that understanding. And not everyone's going to agree with that, but several of the researchers, that's how they distinguish it. And it totally resonated with me. Mm-hmm. And when you said how the importance of that, over the years, even I've said to parents, it is almost impossible to help kids be resilient. And I don't know if you recall in the resilience book and in the discipline book, that one of the main findings about resilience is, in order to be resilient, you need at least one adult who truly believes in you and stands by you. And the late psychologist Julia Siegel called that adult a charismatic adult in a child's life. And while some people, including myself sometimes, I almost wish he hadn't used the word charismatic, and may have different meanings to different people. His definition, Paul, was nothing short of poetic. He says it's an adult from whom a child or adolescent gathers strength. And I love that. And we as adults need charismatic adults as well. Now, why do I bring this up? So I say to parents, just like Daniel Goleman said, a key component of emotional intelligence is empathy. I said, we have to be more empathic. And over the years, I've developed a number of questions that my parenting workshops, I go, like, and I'll mention them now, because just like yourself, I feel empathy is such a vital skill. I'll have parents write down what words would you hope your child uses to describe you? Because I say all kids have words to describe us, just like we have words to describe our parents, whether they're still here or not. Then this I've added, what do you say, intentionally say or do on a regular basis, so they're likely to use the word you hope they use? And the word intentionally, I put in italics in my PowerPoint, because I said, if you want your kids to describe you in a certain way, but you're not intentionally thinking about that, they're not. And again, I'm smiling. I was giving a workshop when there were in-person workshops, and a woman at this point in the audience shouted, "Oh my God." And I remember I thought there was a medical emergency. And then she realized there were 200 other people there. Said, "I'm so sorry, Bob, those questions were wonderful." She said, the first words, it was like now it's just me and her in the room. The first word I hope my kids use to describe me is calm. And I said, "Do you think they will?" This is so funny. I said, "Not at all. I've been yelling at them for 12 years. I don't think that's the first word that they will use." But afterwards, she came up and said, "That's important. How do we hope our kids see us? And what do we intentionally say or do?" And the third question is, what words do you think they will actually use? And, she already said they wouldn't use those words. With the pandemic and all the parenting workshops I've done, I've said, imagine 10 years ago, someone interviewed your children, and it's 10 years later, whether your kids were 5 or 10, 15, whatever, during the pandemic, and asked them to describe you during the pandemic and their relation with you, what do you hope they would say? And it really has gotten into some interesting discussion. So the fact you brought up empathy is the first one. It's a very important concept, because if you can't be empathic, kids know it. If there's that disconnect, and then you're not going to be able to serve as that charismatic adult. The good news is, and here's where that research we talked about is, there are signs of compassion and empathy, even like in kids just a few months old. I mean, the precursors, as I say, of this. And certainly by the time they're 2 or 3, they're there. So then it's how do we facilitate their growth? And, we serve as models in that way, the way we talk to kids, the way we interact with them. And that's what's writing this book during the pandemic has been very heartening and encouraging to me in many ways, because it got me to think about there are things we could do. There are ways we could cultivate these different instincts. So the fact you selected empathy first, you could see it's a major interest of mine. It's led to many questions that parents have told me have been very helpful for them to think about.
Yeah, one thing that I do I in my coaching with fathers is because a lot of them they mirror what their parents did to them, like, "Why are you doing this?" or you should be more responsible at your age, or whatever. Is I have them take pictures of themselves at different ages, the actual age of their kids, and look at their picture and think of, like, when I was 12, try to summon back those memories, and then be empathetic of your child at that same age and the kind of world they had. And that kind of empathy it's hard to come by for a lot of people, because they don't, like you say, you can imagine yourself, you can look at your kid and be like, "Oh yeah, that's a 12-year-old kid." You can be empathetic, but the compassion empathy, where you really say, what is their day like? What are their stresses, is a different way of looking at it.
That's a great technique, by the way, with the photos.
Yeah.
It's very helpful. I had a similar experience, cousins from Canada. When my parents came from Europe, my a large part of my mother's family settled in Canada and the rest in New York, and my father in New York. But this cousin had from his parents photos of my parents when they were in their 20s. And there's my mother throwing a snowball and my father.
Yeah, doing goofy things.
It got me to think about the life they had before they were my parents and seeing these photos and them with their friends. So what you just said, it really evoked a feeling in me because I just had that experience a few weeks ago.
You also talked about how we determine what we think about as intelligence, which I found really a new way of looking at things, and I guess put it in a different way, what you call simultaneous intelligence, like book learning or academic learning versus what is reason and logic and what we're all born with, and how sometimes society determines who are the smart people based on the book learning too much to the extent, and trying to eliminate those cultural differences, which is important in our current.
Thank you for bringing that up also, because, trained as a clinical psychologist, I gave a lot of what were called intelligence tests like the Wechsler, and it's not to put down any intelligence tests, but a lot of them are really, the best way I could say it, measuring acquired knowledge. And so what we try to say on the simultaneous intelligence, it's inborn, and it's how you start to put pieces together. And in the chapter, we give a lot of examples in terms of parents helping by, there's a problem and, how might you solve the problem so you become better problem solvers. And there could be kids who do, it could work either way, who do, very poorly on acquired knowledge. And we talk about the cultural differences, and especially in many ways, you're going to have certain kids who grow up under poverty and racism and have a much more difficult time with some of these questions, and yet may do very well on simultaneous intelligence, how to reason things out, how do things come together. So what we really try to emphasize here, and that's been one of the things about intelligence tests for me, even though I gave a lot of them because they were standardized measures, is what I used to say to myself, well, what are we really measuring? Where a kid goes to school and how well a kid goes? And I used to say to myself, it's the old thing, who would I want on a desert island if I was stranded? I wouldn't necessarily be the person who could tell me George Washington was the first president of the United States. It would be the person who had much more simultaneous intelligence, who could figure out what is needed, and without tools, what we could do. So it was an interesting concept to include under these instincts.
Yes.
It really was. I'm glad we did. Several people like yourself have said that. And moving away from culture, that intelligence based, I'll say, on much more the environment and much more on the schooling you went to and whatever, and this having much more to do with reasoning in that regard, which probably had much more to do with survival, because we talk about instincts helping you survive, than, well, first of all, 300 years ago or so, whatever it was, we didn't even have a president of the United States. It was before that. So some of these discrete facts were less important than some of what we call simultaneous intelligence.
Yeah, I don't think either one of us would discount the academic learning. It doesn't throw away the learning that we all would put in that academic intelligence part, but it's also identifying and valuing the intrinsic intelligence of a lot of people.
Thank you for saying that. I wouldn't want anyone to listen and say, Bob doesn't believe you
wouldn't want to throw away that.
Learn any of these facts. They're very important also. But there's, it's like in different, it was like Howard Gardner, a psychologist at Harvard, who talked about multiple intelligences. We have different intelligences. And he said in schools, it's mathematical, logical skills and verbal skills that get the most attention, which leaves a lot of other kids out who are very good spatially, who are very artistic. And so what you just brought up, your comment is right on. There's all of these different intelligences, and one is we're talking about simultaneous intelligence.
Yeah, I think more in this book, in the Raising a Self-Disciplined Child, you talk a lot about how kids get they go into the school set. Was it in this book or the new book? But you talk about the book.
Probably knowing. I think it's in both.
But they come in curious and wanting to learn and excited and everything, and then we beat it out of them by making it competitive or saying, no, it's great you got the A, but where's the A plus? Or and that's that's a tragedy in our system, I think.
Well, that gets to one of the other instincts. Yeah, it's in this book, but I think it's in the other two because I try to put it everywhere. Like one of the other instincts is intrinsic motivation. And this is a very important one for me because I remember reading the work of us when I was in graduate school, a psychologist at Harvard, Robert White, who said one of the greatest motivations, and at that point, there was a lot of psychoanalytic theory that said sex and aggression. They were important, but he said within every child is a drive for effectiveness. And what he meant is you want to master your environment. You're curious. You're willing to try things. And it's intrinsic. And there too, without going into a lot of detail, because I know we'll run out of time, but what he says is it's a drive. We call, Sam and I are calling it an instinct. And what you just brought up is people say, well, if there's this drive, intrinsic motivation, what happens to some kids? And we say, well, in school, we right away set up extrinsic motivation. Who has the best grade? And we're going to give you this for this. And in the book, we actually have research to show that when you start to give a reinforcer to kids around an activity, it actually lessens their motivation, especially once you withdraw that. Yep. And years of research show that, and at a very early age. Now, that doesn't mean also, I want to temper this. I don't want anyone to hear and say, Bob feels you should never, give a reward. It's okay. But some of the best rewards are your smile, and just showing kids you love them, whether they succeed or not. So we talk a lot about intrinsic motivation, which I've been interested in for over 40 years in terms of, I always ask, how do you create what I call a motivating environment where everyone wants to be? Yeah. And it really is it has to come from you. It's like the concept of flow. You get so into it. And and I mentioned that, in there. So it is, I think there are too many schools I've visited over the years, and certainly not all of them, where I think there's too much emphasis on rewarding kids for things that I think you would be better not rewarding them with external rewards in this regard. Well,
I think in terms of spoiling your child, giving them a cookie is not spoiling them, but giving them a cookie every time they do something, that is where you get into problems. And it's the same way in the schools. If you give a trophy for every time the classic trophy for showing up, it's nice to say good job, but that's.
I know. Well, we could get a trophy for every kid. And if kids are enjoying, to start giving rewards for not the research showed for activities you even like, it makes no sense. So what we say to parents is you model intrinsic motivation, find things your kids are interested in, find their strengths. So what I call islands of competence, a term I coined 40 years ago. What are your kids' strengths? What are their passions? Build on them. Not every kid is going to be great at sports, but what are they great at? Not every kid's going to be great in academics. And so what we're saying is the motivation is there. And what we have to do is look at your kids' interests and passions and further those along. And again, as you know, we give a number of examples of that.
Well, I think that's where it crosses over into the advice for adults, because if we all as adults found ease and flow, I mean, I could be doing a podcast right now, or I could be writing an article. I'd rather be here with you live doing a podcast. So,
me too.
Not to say that I won't write the article later, but ease and flow is just a key concept for all of human development. I think it's great that your research kind of underlines it. The other two that I wanted to touch on, just so I understand them better, is the difference between genuine altruism and virtuous responsibility, and how you differentiate.
Yeah, they really are a lot alike. In our book, we probably in every chapter say these things overlap. So I'm just looking at my I know I wanted to see, did I leave anything out here? You should see the notes, just like you're looking at. I hope it doesn't seem rude. I said, which ones did we mention? Which didn't we? In terms of the altruism, that has and I'll tell you the differences as we try to say in the book, but I also say there's some, certainly overlap. Altruism really is giving to another person or helping without expecting in any way getting anything back. And their research was the serendipitous finding by a psychologist who found one time he was doing another study and he dropped something, and it was like an 18-month-old came and helped to pick it up because he couldn't reach it. He was holding something else. And it was like the whole course of his research on the serendipitous thing, dropping something, changed. And he then found that there were aspects of wanting to help and responsibility. And this is where it overlaps also with compassion and empathy. We do try to make some of these differences. And virtue for us is a value. So there's virtue is, well, I'll stick with altruism now. So it's genuine. You want to be of help to others. It appears very early there. And kids, they even did studies where young kids, where the person could help himself, the kid could see it, they didn't rush in to help. It's like there was something going on where they could sense when you really needed help. And I just wanted to bring that up. That was another intriguing finding. The virtuous responsibility has to do with virtue with us for values, but the responsibility part, what we really try to emphasize there, Paul, it was the whole issue of taking accountability for your actions. That, there are people do things and make up all kinds of excuses why things happen. So here too, there's research to show even young kids will take responsibility for their actions, as long as, here we get the parents, as long as discipline is not harsh and the kid is afraid to take responsibility. And so what we try to capture under fairness and virtuous responsibility for, that you're really helping others. Genuine altruism. I'm looking at these, I'm feeling almost rushed, but genuine altruism, helping others. Responsibility is learning that there's going to be certain actions you take, and you have to be accountable for these actions. You can't make excuses. And it's a very important part of survival, because if you're always making excuses, then you're really not going to hold yourself accountable and change your behavior. I'm sorry if it got a little muddied there, but there are differences. We strongly mention that there's some overlap. It's not, they don't stand by themselves, but the reason we wanted them to be separate chapters is to say there are different things you can do to reinforce them. Yeah, so I hope there was a little clarity there.
You told a personal story in the book about your brother and you measuring glasses of water. I thought was really I love your perspective on this. Is one disappointing thing in talking to my daughter, who's 21 years old now, is this concept that you bring up is fairness, which is an intrinsic value that kids have. And my daughter has told me that unfortunately, one of the negative things that she remembers me as a father is at too earlier an age telling her that life is not fair. And I regret that now, but I think I was blinded by it. I was trying to impart a piece of wisdom that life doesn't always work out the way you do, but what way you'd like it to be, which is this intrinsic idea. But I don't know when you would talk about the fact that life isn't always fair. So I'd love your opinion on that.
No, this is it's a wonderful question. The example was with my twin brother, when my mother used to bring over glasses of water from the faucet.
Love this.
And we would bring the two glasses together, and we'd let her know if one of us had more water. The one who would let her know would be the one with less water. My mother would say, "It's free. I'll get you."
Right. Was your mother a social scientist?
Yeah, I'll tell you, she wasn't, but she was. I mean, intuitively, I'll say the issue. Because again, what is this? The fourth, fifth time I say I'm smiling because I've heard of my kids. One of the things I've said about, which I've seen in terms of saying life is not fair, is, and not that you did this, but it's interesting what our kids remember on this is. I've always said to parents, if a kid is complaining and says it's not fair, which I think in our book, we say they're almost programmed to say that from birth, in that regard, I think it's very important not to rush in and say, look, life just isn't fair, because then we're not validating. And again, I'm not saying this is what we do.
No, I think that's very important.
And I think one of the things I started to say to parents is, say to a kid, and if it's something we're doing, say to a kid, I'm glad you could tell me things are not fair. What do you think will help to make it fairer? Now, when I say this in my parenting workshops, they'll say, what they consider fair is if I let them do whatever they want. I say, you don't really have to do that. You don't have to go along with them, but you can say, what isn't fair? Maybe we could work on this, because I'm smiling. If interviewed my sons, they might say the same thing your daughter did about fairness. Is if we too quickly rush in and say life isn't fair, or I love it when some parents wait till you get to the real world, then you'll see.
Yeah, right. Then you'll see how bad.
But we're not validating what the kid says. This gets to compassion, empathy, which we talk about. You first validate. Validation doesn't mean you agree, and also just say, "I'm glad you could tell me. I'd rather you tell me. Let's see if there's anything we can change. There may not be in this regard." So I think then kids feel they're validated. I think what your daughter's bringing up, probably my sons would mention some of the same things, because I said that is, you really didn't listen. I'm telling you things aren't fair, and you're telling me life isn't fair. So some parent might say, so I'm just agreeing with you, but the kid is feeling not that way. Not that way at all. It's the same thing. I've seen well-meaning parents in family therapy where one teenage girl said, for opening comment, I'm feeling depressed. Her father didn't say anything, but the mother right away jumped in. And the mother was a lovely person, but had difficulty accepting the girl's distress and said, honey, there's no reason for you to be depressed. We love you and whatever. The girl didn't want to say anything else, Paul, during that session, because she's saying, I'm depressed. And the mother's saying, there's no reason to be. This was a loving mother. It was her own anxiety, not wanting to see her daughter so distressed, trying to be encouraging, but of course it backfired in that remark. But over the years, my brother and I stopped measuring the water.
Well, that's good to hear. Yeah. Well, I love the fact that in your book, you really invite parents to have these kind of conversations, and this distinction between authoritative and authoritarian, I think is really important in how people look at it. And the fact that you can ask your kids directly, like, do you agree with the way I'm doing this? What would you suggest? If you think 10 o'clock is too early to go out, what would you be? If you were in my position, how late do you think I should let you go out? And those types of conversations can be had at almost any age, and you can get real agreement from them and buy-in that you wouldn't expect.
Yeah, some parents are hesitant to do it, but I'm so glad you brought it up, and we give a couple of examples in the book of that.
I like the nagging one. The nagging.
Nag is one of my favorites. I always say to parents, and you may be alluding to that. Here I am laughing again, because some parents think I'm crazy. I say to your kid, do you think I'm nagging you? And many parents will say, what are you, crazy? Of course they're going to think. I say, yeah, but then you could say, oh, I'm glad you could tell me, because I don't want to nag you. So we have to figure out, what we could do. So I'm not nagging, but you're also following through with something. And you know what it is? I've been writing a lot. Could be a whole other book on how do you prepare people to hear a message so that there's not a knee-jerk reaction. So that's why I brought in nagging. If you say to your kid, do you think I'm nagging? Then anything else that follows, I'm telling you, they're not going to have this knee-jerk reaction. Or even when I do therapy, I have something to say to you. Let me know if you disagree, especially with adolescents. They're always going to disagree, it seems like. But the fact you said it, invited them, it really helps that. It really has a lot to do with what I call empathic communication. It has empathy again, preparing people to hear a message in a non-defensive way. Because one of the negative, instincts we talk about really has a lot to do with, this rigid belief that this person is going to just say negative things to me. So preparation, I've been doing a lot of thinking about it in my clinical work and parenting, and how it could play a very important role. Yeah. Boy, your questions have triggered me all over the place. Thank you.
Well, I would love to just talk with you all day long, because you and I are in sync in so many things. I've learned so much from your books, and this last book, Tenacity in Children, Nurturing the 7 Instincts of Lifetime Success. I think there's just a lot of great stuff, and I love the way you clearly are an academic. You've studied the research, and you and Sam Goldstein have looked at the data. This is not a self-help book in that classic vein, but there's plenty of self-help and actual examples, things to do, tips for parenting that I think would give any parent new insights. Really,
thank you so much. And this hour has flown by. It's just a pleasure to be interviewed. It's very, very therapeutic for me, because I've laughed many times as we've shared stories of our kids, and even around serious topics. So our hope is that this book, born out of, I'll say, the pandemic, because that's when it was basically written, will be helpful to parents well beyond that, as we look at, how we help kids to be and to stress those things, compassionate and caring and altruistic, those wonderful qualities that really lead to a great deal of survival. Thank you so much for having me on.
Thank you very much, Dr. Robert Brooks, and your partner, Sam Goldstein, for this book and for taking the time with us today.
My pleasure.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.